Thank you for those remarks. Now, our first opening panel, From Washington to the Middle East, the effect of U.S. elections on regional affairs, will be moderated by my friend, Dr. Abderrahim Foukara, who is the Bureau Chief of Aljazeera Americas. This panel is scheduled for 1 hour and 10 minutes. It will conclude at 10:45, which is a little bit less than 1 hour, 10 minutes, but perhaps I will show you some mercy. And Dr. Foukara, you will introduce your panelists themselves. So the floor is yours, sir.
يسعد صباحكم بألف خير. مرحبا بكم في هذه الندوة في منتدى الخليج الدولي. Top of the morning to you all. Welcome to this panel at the Gulf International Forum. I have the privilege of, as we just heard, moderating this panel. My name is Abderrahim Foukara. I'm the Bureau Chief of Aljazeera International in the Americas and host of, in Washington, a weekly current affairs show on Aljazeera Arabic. So, we've heard a lot about what we're going to discuss during this panel, so there's no point in me reiterating some of those issues. Let me just explain a little bit very quickly the lay of the land. So I'll introduce our esteemed panelists in a little while. We have till 10:45. I'll do 2 rounds of questions with the panelists, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. You have cards for writing questions, and somebody will bring those questions to me. If you could write as clearly as possible. Sometimes I write stuff, I can't always read my own handwriting. So just to make it a little easier for me to rattle through your questions, please be clear and concise. Now, the guests, let me quickly introduce them. You have their bios in the agendas. You have copies of them, but let me just quickly rattle through them all. I have Dr. James Zogby, right to my left. He is the director of Zogby Research Services and founder of the Arab American Institute. Next to him is Dr. Stephen A. Cook, ENI Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies, and the Director of the International Affairs Fellowship for Tenured International Relations Scholars at the Council on Foreign Relations. Next to Dr. Cook is Natasha Hall, who is a Senior Fellow at the Middle East Program, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Last but not least is Matthew Duss, who is the Executive Vice President of the Center for International Policy. Without further ado, let's get down to it, and I will start with James. How might Arab American and Muslim American voters influence the outcome of the election on November 5th?
I always get asked that question, how are the little brown people feeling? That's the, there could be a war in the Middle East, and the first question will be, how are your people taking it? It's going to have an impact. We've done polling on it, and it is decidedly an issue. We've been polling Arab American voters for 30 or more years. And when we ask the question, what are the top 3 issues for you in this election? Every other year we've polled. We always get a lineup exactly the same as the country as a whole. Just one funny story. Howard Dean came to speak at an event that we did in 2003 during that 2004 election. And he came in saying, I'm real nervous. I don't know what to do. I was with the ADL yesterday and spoke to them, and this is complicated. I said, no, not really. He said, well, what do I say? I said, say to us exactly the same thing you said to them, or else you're not being honest. Okay, let me think about it. So he went away, and he came back, and he said, I figured out. First, I'm going to talk about jobs, and then healthcare, and education, and then I'll get into your issues. I said, no, sir, you got it wrong, because my people need work. They go to school, and they want their kids to have a better future, and they want their parents to be healthy. Those are our issues. If you mean the war in Iraq and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, those are your issues. Those are problems you created, I didn't. So get it straight. So when we poll Arab Americans, that's what we'd get. Jobs, number one issue. Healthcare, number two. Down the line. This is the first election in the 30 plus years we've been polling where the issue of the Middle East comes in the top three. And among Democrats, Gaza is number one. As I wrote in an article recently, it looms large over the election. And it looms large in the following ways. There is for the first time in the last 15 years, we've had Arab Americans 2-to-1 Democrat and voting 2-to-1 Democrat. This is the first time that since actually the turn of the century where the numbers have dropped to a slight Democratic edge in party ID and a slight Republican edge in how they would prefer to vote. Donald Trump is leading by a couple points among Arab Americans. Contrary to some of the stuff you've seen, no, Jill Stein's not getting 40% of the Arab American vote. That was a survey of people's members. They sent an email out to their members. That's not a poll. The polling shows that the third-party candidates will get some votes, single digits like usual, but it's going to be almost a dead heat between Trump and Harris. And the Trump numbers don't go up significantly from where they were. What happens is that the Democratic numbers drop precipitously. So there's an extent of punishing Democrats, and there's a sense of, just a sort of bewilderment about the election. They don't like Donald Trump, but they're not at all happy with voting for Democrats. And she's not distinguished herself as different, and so she's not getting the vote. So it's going to have an impact. And there's no way I can create a map of victory for Democrats that doesn't have Michigan and Pennsylvania in it. And we know that our numbers count in those two states because in the last three elections, the Democrats have put money into Arab American vote turnout in those two states. They know we're important in those states. This year they're not doing that. They've decided they'll bypass this community and I guess find votes with Liz Cheney if they think that that's actually going to work. But they're not doing anything for outreach, and so I think it's worrisome.
Thank you. Steve Cook, how might U.S. foreign policy and security cooperation with regional partners and allies differ under a Trump versus Harris administration?
Well, thank you. That's the question I get all the time. And I'm glad you get your question, and glad I get this question. I think that overall, when you dig into Trump foreign policy in the Middle East and Harris foreign policy in the Middle East, and let me just preface this by saying this is all implied by things that we think we may know or may think that we know. I think that Trump has not been consistent, obviously, in his approach to the Middle East. It depends on what his gut is telling him on a certain day or who the last person he spoke to the night before he decides to post some policy issue on social media. But it strikes me that in thinking about what they might do, either candidate might do, that there's a lot more overlap between the two candidates than our polarized politics would suggest. In terms of security policy, I think it's clear, as I think Daniel pointed out, that there is a tremendous interest in extending and continuing the Abraham Accords, and there is a huge security component to that. I think the difference is, however, where the President Trump talks about extending the Abraham Accords, it's really mostly related to normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I don't think a Trump administration is going to be terribly interested in a security pact with Saudi Arabia, if only because it violates every principle of America first and make America great again. I think that the Harris administration would be interested in a security pact with Saudi Arabia, yet she'll face more pressure and feel more pressure from the left of the Democratic Party on human rights issues. In terms of overall security, the security relationship with Israel, I expect absolute continuity between the two of them. I don't see there being a significant amount of change. Harris has, at particular moments, demonstrated a little bit of daylight between herself and Biden. I mean, that is the role of the vice president, is to support the policy. At critical moments at Selma and in other places, she has said, she has articulated empathy for the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, but I don't believe that that portends any real significant change in the relationship between the United States and Israel. Over a longer period of time, I think there is a changing politics of the relationship, and we'll see what happens. When it comes to President Trump, I think that there is this sense, and I think that Congressman Rahal articulated it, that somehow that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu and Jared Kushner work in lockstep. That's actually not really the case. I read Jared Kushner's memoir, so all of you don't have to. And it was clear, it was a very bad book, shockingly so, among the worst I've read, that actually President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu did not get along at all. You would think that was the one thing I learned in the memoir, and that Trump was actually supportive of Benny Gantz in the series of elections that took place in Israel during Trump's tenure. Why? Because he didn't trust Netanyahu. But even so, regardless of who is going to be the Israeli prime minister, and it's likely to be someone named Netanyahu, I think that the relationship between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government will be strong.
Thank you, Steve. Natasha, with the upcoming US elections on the 5th of November, how do you see the potential shifts in US foreign policy under either Trump or Kamala, impacting humanitarian interventions in ongoing Middle Eastern crises such as Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, the list goes on?
Well, thank you for the question that I always get. And I'm assuming you mean humanitarian aid interventions, not humanitarian interventions to stop bloodshed, because I think those days are pretty much over. I would repeat the caveats that Dr. Cook had about the fact that we don't really know what is about to transpire between either of these candidates.
Dr. Cook, you have to just call me Steve, please. Thank you.
And that's primarily because the Biden administration on these issues their reputation has been quite abysmal, not just in Gaza, but they've slashed aid budgets for Syria and other conflicts in the region as well. But I still think that we will see quite a bit of daylight on this issue, especially when it comes to Gaza between the two candidates. And that's primarily because we saw the Trump administration cut funding entirely for UNRWA during his administration. Year upon year, he tried to slash foreign aid budgets more generally by about 30% every year. Congress pretty much stopped him from doing that. But we know what his intentions are. That could be remedied by his need to improve PR. For example, nobody likes to see starving babies on their television screens. And I just want to emphasize a couple of points on this, since we really don't know entirely what the differences will be between the two candidates. I assume Kamala Harris will emphasize humanitarian aid much more, especially in places like Lebanon and Gaza, which will be on all of our television screens, I think, for some time now, whereas forgotten conflicts like Syria and Yemen may not be. But there's two really important points here, and one of them is that humanitarian aid does not solve conflicts. I don't know how many times we have to learn this lesson, but the United States gets impatient with these wars, and we've seen it just continuously throw humanitarian aid and sanctions at it with no theory of change. And I do think that there's a danger in Lebanon and in the Palestinian territories, both the West Bank and Gaza, that we will simply sort of fund humanitarian aid and hope that the problem kind of goes away. And that simply is never the case, because that aid is filtered through the same violent, corrupt power structures that existed pre-conflict if you're not doing anything on the political side. So that's one thing. The other thing, and this is where we also might see, hopefully, I think, some daylight between the two candidates, is that funding humanitarian aid does not lead to humanitarian access. If you fund humanitarian aid, but it is not getting into the hands of people that actually need it, it doesn't count. And so we've seen a lot of Israeli officials talk about calorie counts and all of these things. This doesn't mean anything for humanitarian aid. People are severely malnourished, and there needs to be immediate humanitarian access and protection for humanitarian workers. And that requires really rigorous diplomacy to stop the humanitarian crisis and to get that access. And I see that much more forcefully, potentially with a Kamala Harris administration than with a Trump administration that probably doesn't want to deal with those kinds of details. But it's going to be, the devil will be in those details in the months to come in order to improve outcomes, at least in the near term.
How might a Trump versus Harris administration change U.S. policy on the Gaza war in particular?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for inviting me to be here. It's a real privilege to be here with these colleagues. I don't disagree with a lot of what I just heard. I mean, with Vice President Harris, we don't have a great deal to go on. We do have a few public statements, as Steve said. The speech in Selma, which I think reflected what had already been, I think, reported about some of her internal, the internal debates where she had been pressing for greater humanitarian aid and pressing the Israelis. And then we saw her remarks after the one-on-one with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where she was, I think, notably forceful on that point. She has not distanced herself, as I don't think anyone really expected her to really distance herself from the president's policy, as catastrophic as I think that policy has clearly been. I think there are things she could have said and still can say to put some daylight, to give some indication, which I think, in my view, both politically and ethically and strategically would be wise. She's chosen not to do that. She's clearly playing it very safe, just on the whole range of policy issues, saying essentially the bare minimum that she feels she needs to say to kind of satisfy certain constituencies within the party in order to win. And from a pragmatic, political standpoint, that does make some sense. Again, I don't know how much difference we should actually expect, should she take office. I do think there are a few key differences between what we might expect between a Harris administration and a Trump administration. One is what we've seen from Biden. One of the few areas that I think are commendable in their approach to Israel-Palestine is the imposition of sanctions on extremist settlers and organizations and even officials in the government connected to settler violence. This is very long overdue. I think this is really the first meaningful imposition of any consequences on the Israeli side for clear, long-standing systemic violations of international humanitarian law and violations of U.S. policy, given that our existing policy is still a two-state solution. I think the tools that were put on the table with that executive order earlier this year, they've only started to use some of those smaller tools. I mean, this is actually a fairly expansive set of tools, and if you doubt that, I think, just look what the settler leaders themselves are saying. They're clearly very concerned. This is the United States potentially starting to use its financial might, even though I personally think the sanctions tools are vastly overused. If they are connected to an actual ask of a policy change, as I think they are in this case, stop doing this thing, and then there won't be any, then we'll remove the sanctions. I think, they can be more effective. So I think pushing on that and tying it to, one of the real differences we're going to see is I think a Harris administration will rhetorically continue to support a two-state solution. A Trump administration will dismiss with that entirely. They may say the words, but we've already seen what the Trump peace plan is. It's just a Palestinian Bantustan plan with complete control and sovereignty of Israel from the river to the sea. Friedman, Kushner have all been behind this. Whatever term they'll use about Palestinian self-government, it will all be nonsense. You might get a slight upgrade in these Bantustans from kind of economy class occupation to premium economy occupation. They'll change the drapes. That will be it. But I think teeing off something Steve said too, part of what's interesting or dangerous about Trump is just his unpredictability. One never knows what appeals to Trump in the moment. whatever, I think we can safely say that Trump will do whatever he thinks, demonstrates the awesomeness of Donald Trump at any given time. And I think this is also why he may actually be interested in this, the Saudi-Israeli-U.S. deal, simply because Joe Biden will not have been able to do it. I think that is something that might be attractive to him. As for whether Harris will continue down that, she may. I would hope. I think some of the people who are advising her are rightly skeptical of this. In my view, this is not just driven by regional factors, but it's also very much a play to box China out of the region, given how obsessed this administration and this entire city has become with China. And the U.S.-Saudi kind of pact is a key part of this, and they've chosen to kind of wrap it in this nice candy coating of peace with Israel to kind of bring some Democrats on board. But ultimately, I don't think either administration would be able to bring this home for different reasons. So those are just a couple of the differences, I think.
Thank you, James. Back to you. Based on the polling data that you have, how do you believe that a Trump versus Harris win could impact the situation in Gaza and Lebanon?
I kind of think that's what they have been dealing with as well. I'd say the following. You don't just elect a candidate, you elect a coalition. You're with partners. The coalition that is today's Republican Party, that's not really a Republican Party, it's a party of Trump. My brother jokingly says we need a third party in America, a Republican Party. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a cult. They are not interested at all in resolving these conflicts, and he reflects that, I think, in his thinking. There's no Nobel Peace Prize at the end of the day. His main coalition partner, the religious right, is not interested at all in pulling back. And so I don't expect in a Trump administration we'd see anything differently than what we already saw, with maybe the addition that Jared Kushner would get a chance to build his beach resort on the Gaza beaches. I think the Harris coalition, on the other hand, is diverse. Yes, there's pro-Israel elements. There's also, if we look at our polling, what we're seeing is not only for the first time ever are attitudes towards Palestinians more favorable than attitude toward Israelis, especially among Democrats. But the composition of who makes that happen is what's intriguing, because young voters, almost 2-to-1, Black, Latino, Asian voters, also a strong plurality, more favorable. Similarly, 2-to-1 want to suspend arms shipments to Israel. 2-to-1 want an immediate ceasefire. If Harris were to, we asked the question, if Harris were to demand a ceasefire and suspend aid if Israel didn't move on that, her numbers go from 41 almost to 60%, with a lot of those coming from Trump. Those are the punished Democrat votes, but also wiping out whatever was going to go to third parties. So it's in her interest, in her coalition interest. That's where the pressure will be on the Democratic side to move in that direction. Will she do it? Well, I always like to think that, or say rather, that the way they run is the way they govern. I mean, what Jesse Jackson used to call the smart-ass white boys, who today aren't white or boys anymore. It's like it's an equal opportunity employer. The consultant class, they are, you can't do this and don't say that. No, you really can't say, don't, and it ties a candidate up in knots when you've got this blob of advisors who have no basis in reality for the arguments they make, but they tie a candidate up from being able to take a courageous stand. And she's been held in their sway since this election began. And I'm afraid if she doesn't break from that, she'll be tied in knots if she wins for 4 years. Her instinct is different. It's one of those let Kamala be Kamala situations, but she hasn't shown the willingness or the ability to break from them. But her coalition is decidedly different than the Republican coalition, so there will be pressure on her to continue to move, to deal with Palestinian rights, to deal with an end to this war, to deal with arms shipments, to deal with humanitarian assistance, and to carve out a decidedly different Middle East policy. That's where the coalition is.
Steve, back to you now. We obviously live in the context of escalating tensions between Iran and Israel. Do you expect the 5th of November, or January if you're talking about inauguration, to herald a new regional order in the Middle East?
No. Not yet, maybe. But first, before I answer the question, I'm super glad that Jim used the term blob to refer to another group of people rather than my community. I think that there is a new regional, new global order that is happening. We are at that, I go back to grad school where I read a lot of Gramsci, and we're at that moment where one order is ending, but the new one hasn't been born yet. And that new order is born by the actors themselves and what they are doing and how they respond to it. So how the United States responds to China. Is the United States obsessed with China? Is China actually real? Is the China threat actually real? How do the Israelis respond to the Iranians and the Iranians respond back? And how does the rest of the region respond to this conflict? Is all of this, this friction, this dialectic is going to create a regional order. The problem is, right now we don't know what that order looks like and who are going to be the primary actors in that order. There are groups of countries that are vying to lead that order however it emerges, and you have actors within the region who say, we have agency, we're going to shape the regional order. So this is actually, I think, a long-term process that is going to be marked by a fair amount of instability and competition among both actors external to the region as well as regional actors who want to shape it. I think the Abraham Accords are one gambit in seeking to order the region that had, have a 4 or 5 year head start, but obviously the conflicts that are now roiling the region right now are setting the region on a somewhat different trajectory. One of the things I find most interesting about this present moment is that we have essentially a number of conflicts in the Levant, some extending obviously to Iran and Israel. Yet at the same time, you have a number of countries that are seeking to advance in different agendas, remain committed to the idea of normalization, including Saudi Arabia. And so how do these dynamics play out against the backdrop of the violence in Gaza and Lebanon, the perhaps permanent statelessness of the Palestinian people, the displacement of large numbers of Lebanese people? What has been striking to me as this new regional order and global order is being born is quite actually how stable Israel's diplomatic relations are with the rest of the region. I would have expected countries to break off relations with the Israelis after all of this. So we are certainly in a new era, but we are hampered by the fact that we're not there yet, and it's up for grabs, and there's no real way to describe it. We're in that very ugly interregnum between a dying old order and a new one that hasn't yet been born.
Center holding?
I'm sorry?
The center holding?
I'm not sure that it is.
Natasha, going back to the issue of Hezbollah, how would eliminating Hezbollah's leadership impact Iran's regional policy and its network of proxies and allies in the region And what sort of policy do you think either Harris or Trump will have to deal with that?
It's a very good question. I have spent the majority of the past 20 years working on either Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon. And what I have learned the hard way is that Iran plays the long game rather successfully. Iran and Hezbollah are significantly beaten down, and I would even say humiliated now. But they have faced this before, and they've proven to be resilient in the face of tactical losses by being able to maneuver in conflict-affected countries where others have simply given up or they're just too impatient. They have won in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon through attrition and tenacity, not through military superiority. So I think you can decapitate a leadership like Hezbollah, but they will rebuild, they will regroup. Israel has killed the leader of Hezbollah before. They got Hassan Nasrallah. They've degraded Hezbollah significantly in 2006, and Hezbollah grew back more powerful than ever before. Now they have all of the territory from the Mediterranean to Iran to recuperate in, so good luck getting rid of all of them. And what's more, I think you can always create new groups, right? And that's what we've seen. And so I think we can see that, not in the near term, but definitely in the mid to long term. The other thing that we will probably see, given Iran has proxies and its nuclear program for deterrence, so if their proxies are degraded, they may accelerate the nuclear program. And I should say, also on that point, that Israel has targeted nuclear facilities, probably most successfully in 2010 with Stuxnet, and destroyed hundreds of Iranian centrifuges. And Iran just turned around and started accelerating development again. So it's not clear to me how well this will work, even within a year's time. On the differences between a Harris and a Trump administration, it's difficult to know. Obviously, the Democrats have always been much more conciliatory towards Iran. I suspect, but I don't know, because Trump also probably, it depends on if the isolationists on Trump's team win out over the more hawkish elements of the Republican Party here. But I could imagine them going along with Israel's plans to potentially occupy a southern strip of Lebanon, attack nuclear facilities, things like that. I do think a Harris administration would be much more cautious on those things and try for a more conciliatory approach towards Iran in the near and sort of the midterm as well. So, I mean, I do think that there is somewhat of a danger there with the Trump administration. That said, I do think that both administrations would continue to sort of double down on the Abraham Accords and normalization deals and security pacts as kind of creating a bulwark against Iran. But I simply don't know how well that will actually work, because Iran will still have access to places like Syria and sort of other vacuums.
Thank you, Matt, to end the second round of these questions with you, and I hope that nothing will peel off again while I'm asking you the question. How might the Trump versus Harris administration change U.S. policy on Iran in particular?
Yeah, I mean, clearly I think Trump is going to be more hawkish toward Iran. I mean, withdrawing from the Iran deal was, one of his major steps on Iran. And as I said before about, what drives Trump's decision making, I don't think Trump clearly didn't understand what the Iran deal was about. All he knew was that he didn't like the black president's deal with Iran. I mean, that was more or less like what drove his decision to destroy it. he could, again, he wakes up one morning, someone gets in his ear and says, Joe Biden couldn't get back into the Iran nuclear deal, maybe President Trump could. He could very well surprise us. I'm skeptical of that, but I would not rule it out. But yeah, I think, and just, the word isolationist, I know that word gets used again about Trump and about the new Republican Party. I tend to disagree with that a bit. I think he's kind of a unilateralist. I mean, if you look at his presidency, yes, he's very skeptical of multilateral organizations, NATO, et cetera, because his whole argument, whether domestic or foreign, is we're getting ripped off, and people need to pay us. And that's kind of how he approaches foreign policy. I wouldn't call it isolationist. It's in many ways just kind of old school imperialist. He's like, this is how the protection racket works. You need to give us money, you need to pay us tribute, you need to buy our weapons. If you remember that meeting with Mohammed bin Salman in the Oval Office where he kind of pulled out the chart of weapons like it was the side of a Good Humor ice cream truck and pointing out all the things that he expected the Saudis to buy, that's just kind of how he approaches things. So I could see him being drawn in. I would see kind of a couple factions within the Trump administration is the kind of old school hawkish primacists, who see just American power in the Middle East as a value in and of itself. And then you've got the prioritizers who see the real issue as China and the Middle East, Europe, these other areas are distractions from the real challenge of this century, of this era, which is US-China strategic competition. And that could play out in a number of different ways. That could play out in a kind of a reinvestment in expanding the Abraham Accords, because I think Trump understands the Abraham Accords, or was made to understand the Abraham Accords as a way of extracting the United States from the Middle East, although I think our partners in the Middle East see it as a way of keeping the United States, kind of embedded in the Middle East. So those are some possibilities of how Trump could go. I think if Vice President Harris takes office, I could see some effort, especially given the new administration in Iran, to at least explore the possibility of diplomacy of some smaller nuclear deal. Obviously, the JCPOA is dead, but the idea of putting a cap on Iran's nuclear program, delaying, the time within which Iran could potentially have enough uranium for a nuclear weapon, is still very much in the U.S. interest. I think it's a shared interest in the region and with our partners in Europe. So I could see some investment there. But again, as I said earlier, it's, we're all kind of reading the tea leaves on this and judging, okay, who is advising her and what role have they played, what have they said and written in the past, and having to go on that.
Thank you. With that, we conclude the 2 rounds of questions to the panelists. I look forward to receiving some of your questions and comments to put to the panelists. And while I'm waiting for that, let me just toss out one question to anybody who wants to actually tackle it from the panelists. What are the key challenges the next US administration, whether it's Trump or Kamala Harris, will face in maintaining relationships with the Gulf countries, particularly considering growing Chinese and Russian influence in the region? Anyone who wants to take it, feel free to.
I'll take a stab at it. Look, I think that they're now, after 25, 30 years where there wasn't an alternative to the United States, there are alternatives, but are they real alternatives is the question. I don't think that leaders in the Gulf roll out of bed and look towards Beijing or look towards Moscow. What they want, though, is they want what they call American leadership. They want they want when American officials when they say we are committed to the stability and the security of the region, they want them to mean it. And so what they mean by that is when Houthis fire missiles on Saudi population centers or Emirati population centers, for the United States to at least make a phone call, to at least do something. I think the biggest sin, among the biggest sins, I don't want to say the biggest sin, there's been lots of sins, was when President Trump in September 2019 didn't respond to the Iranian attack on Abqaiq and Khurais. That is something that comes up in a list of 20 years of complaints that the Gulf leaders have. And so that has encouraged a hedge towards the Chinese and towards the Russians. We're still at a moment where leaders in the region said, there's no replacement for the United States, but they also say that the relationships that they have with the Chinese are absolutely permanent relations. That so if there is a security pact between Saudi Arabia and the United States, this does not mean that the Saudis are going to kick the Chinese out of the kingdom. So it is a very different regional political environment in which there are other actors that the United States has to contend with. I think, and that's something that this new order is going to characterize this new order that we were talking about a short while ago.
James?
I completely agree with you about the emergent new order.
You can stop there.
No, I'm going to enlarge. I'm
Completely
going
agree.
to enlarge on it. No, I think that if you just think, literally a generation ago, just 30-something years, the end of the Cold War, and we were the emergent superpower in the world, no one else to compete with. We had Bush and Baker mobilizing a coalition to liberate Kuwait, and succeeded. And then it's been downhill since, expanding NATO and aggravating Russia, and then going beyond that to the just absolutely foolish Iraq War and the way it was fought, and Afghanistan. We went from being a power respected to a power that had been weakened severely in the eyes of the world. If you look at opinion polling, we had never been as low as we were in those first few years of the Iraq War. The number went up, and then they went back down again because promises made but not delivered. I think that one of the problems that American leaders have right now is failing to recognize that we're not the shining light on the hill. We're not the superpower
Agreed, yep.
that can do whatever it wants to do. They haven't figured out a role yet, but are still acting. We listen to Joe Biden talk about Ukraine or talk about Israel, Iran. Echoes of Churchill, echoes of Reagan, but we're not there anymore. And what is interesting as we see the new relationships taking shape is that, yes, there's a fear of Iran, but there's also Saudi-Iranian ties, UAE-Iranian. I mean, the countries in the Gulf are beginning to develop ties with Iran, and some with Israel as well. I've argued that what we need to look to the future is a kind of an OSCE in the region that brings together all the parties the way Europe, East-West, didn't solve problems, but it stabilized the situation. It can't come from the United States, which has no longer the credibility to do it. It's got to come from the bottom up. And so I don't expect an expansion of I don't expect Saudi Arabia to want to normalize ties with Israel. There's just no tolerance for it in the kingdom at all. And on the question of China, when we poll, we ask, who's the most powerful country for your country today? In the Gulf countries, we get US here, China there. We say, in the next 10 years, who will be the most powerful country for your country in the Middle East? China here, US there. In the next 20 years, who will be? China's numbers go up. The gap today versus the complete reverse. And we do that with public opinion. We also do it with business leaders in the region. Now, granted, this doesn't translate automatically to policy, but there's a sentiment in the region that the US is on the downside, China's on the upswing, and they are looking east for investment. They're looking east for...
Undoubtedly the case. My point was just that they're preternaturally disposed towards the United States and the West,
and the dollar.
rather than. But of course, that's why they're saying that that they're not going to kick the Chinese out of the region,
and nor are the Russians.
Those relationships are permanent, of course.
And so the issue is, how do we deal in a world where we do have now superpower conflicts? We also have regional powers. We have them in each country, whether it's Libya or Sudan or Yemen, or they're all stacked up in different lineups in all of them. And you can't play whack-a-mole. You've got to somehow figure out a way to rationalize this. And the way to do that is an OSCE. And I think that that's where countries in the region are heading, but they need encouragement and support to do that, to build from the bottom up this new relationship, the new emergent order. It can't come from the US and it can't come from China alone.
Natasha.
Yeah, so I would just add one thing to your original question on this. I do think that Gulf countries and other countries in the world are very effectively using China as a boogeyman, right, to get whatever they want from the United States. And I suspect that will increase in the future. And I think the United States needs to be careful of that. That happened during the Cold War when a lot of dictatorships were using communism as the boogeyman at that time, whether or not it was an actual threat or not. In many cases, it was not. So I think that's a big issue for the United States, that it will lose a lot of its leverage with some allies and partners, and we've already been seeing that because they are dangling sort of this China threat in front of the United States.
I have a few questions from the audience. Let me start with this one, and it's from Augustus Alzona in the audience. He's saying, whoever wants to tackle it, who's been killing more Arab Christians since 1982, since October 7th, 2023, just to circle back to what the Congressman Rahal said in his keynotes? James? Anybody else?
Well, I think the worst situation was Iraq. The Chaldean and Assyrian communities decimated more than decimated. I think, yeah, I mean, if the question is a number, Iraq is the place where Christianity suffered the most. I think there's a fear in Egypt. There was a fear in Egypt under Morsi. During those years, the second largest group of asylees coming into the U.S. were Egyptian Copts and Chaldeans after that. Lebanon's secure. It's interesting about Syria that it was completely misunderstood. I mean, I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and they wanted to sanction Bashar al-Assad for persecuting Christians, because that's the way Republicans on that commission operated. It had to be persecuting Christians. They found some country that nobody even knew existed. How's he treating Christians? That'd be the question. Persecuting Muslims didn't matter. Persecuting Christians was a big issue. But they wanted to do it for persecuting Christians, and then the group of 8 patriarchs from Syria came and said, for God's sake, leave it alone. He's not persecuting us. Actually, we feel protected in Damascus. And so I think that's not always understood, the role of Christians in different countries. But clearly, I think Iraq is the worst case, and Egypt. Fear in Egypt after that.
Okay, I have 2 questions addressed to Natasha, but I will refrain from asking them for now. Let me take this one to you, Matt. It says, it's from Jesse Schatz, Corvus. Much of this discussion has focused on the region's ongoing military conflicts. But how do you see a new administration impacting non-military issues, increasing Chinese influence in the Gulf, sanctions enforcement, technology cooperation, India, Middle East economic corridor, and so on?
Yeah, no, really good question and a complicated one. On the tech issue, I think that is one area where we know that the vice president has been pretty involved. I mean, when she was in the Senate on the Intelligence Committee, there was a great piece by Michael Hirsch in Foreign Policy about this a few months ago, shortly after she became the nominee. So that is one area where we do, know a bit about where her interests are. So I think she's going to lean forward on that. And I'll also say, I mentioned one area where the Biden administration had done well, I think, on Israel-Palestine, on the settler sanction. I'll also note some of the designations of spyware. Some of the work that's been done out of the White House on the use of spyware has actually been very, very good. I think that is one of the few areas that I would relate to human rights where they have actually done some really good things, and I would hope and expect that she's going to continue forward with that work, because I mean, this administration has actually stood firm in the face of really heavy lobbying by a number of these firms and a number of these governments that really enjoy using this spyware to spy on their own people domestically and in other countries. But I also think the question, okay, if we're not looking just through the military lens, what are some other tools? And I think that's a really important one as well. Obviously, I think they'll continue to employ, economic sanctions on Iran related to their nuclear program and human rights. But I would also mention something here that we've not talked about yet, which is just democracy in the region more broadly. It's something we don't really talk about as much in Washington. I think we should think about it a bit more. Obviously, the last 20 years have shown quite clearly that the United States does not have the ability to kind of transform the region and to build democracies. But I do think going back to the Arab awakening and some of those demonstrations and then the crushing of those movements, I think we should, and I hope we will, think a bit more about what tools we have, not necessarily at the government level, but in the way that governments can kind of protect space for civil societies from our country and amongst that region and with Europe and from the global south as well, to build those ties, to build those networks. Because I think ultimately, in my view, that is the only thing that is going to deliver true and enduring stability in that region, and frankly, anywhere else in the world, is if you have governments that are actually delivering for their people.
A question now to Natasha Hall from Paulette Lee in the audience. It says, what's the point of the US providing humanitarian aid with one hand and sending arms and funds for war to Israel with the other?
It's a very good question. I don't really have an answer to that for several different reasons. I mean, obviously, adding fuel to the fire and the continuous bombardment of Gaza is going to lead to a bigger humanitarian crisis. But it will also impede humanitarian aid. We've seen an enormous number of humanitarian workers killed, medical personnel killed, hospitals being attacked. The way that you weaken a population is not just by impeding humanitarian aid, it's by destroying and getting rid of all of the things needed for their survival. And I was very much involved in the way that the Assad regime did this in Syria over the past 13 years. This is, siege, bombardment of hospitals. This is par for the course. So I don't have a good answer in that regard. What I would say, though, is that it will be difficult to pry away the United States from Israel. This is a partnership, a strong partnership that is decades in the making. So purely from a humanitarian perspective, if there is a way that there can be safe areas where people aren't constantly displaced, if there is a way to get wastewater treatment plants going, waste management going, it will save lives. The problem is there is no aid going into Gaza. I mean, we just saw this letter from Defense Secretary Austin and Antony Blinken, really detailing, what we know to be the case, which is that there's been a 90% reduction in trucks going to North Gaza, and now we're seeing famine conditions there, and a reduction in 50% of trucks. And I should note, and this is a big frustration for me on the humanitarian side, trucks don't necessarily mean what people actually need. People are surviving on flour right now. So again, when you hear Israeli officials saying people are getting the minimum amount of calories, flour, you can't survive off of that. Children can't survive off of that. Pregnant women can't survive off of that. So I do hope that there is movement on that, regardless of where the conflict stands, but it is very difficult to get humanitarian aid into these kinds of areas if there isn't some kind of ceasefire or pause in some part of the territory.
A kind of related question from me to you, Steve, on this. We sometimes hear that the U.S. has a set of interests in the Middle East. The Israelis have a set of interests in the Middle East. To what extent do you feel that both sets of interests match 100%, and to what extent do you think that they diverge in different points?
Well, I don't think that they match 100%. I think that is extraordinarily high bar. But as Natasha said, this is a partnership that has deepened over the course of the last 50 years. October 1973, a partnership that has really deepened. And I think, just to pick up on something that Natasha was saying, the reason why this is so difficult to answer is that there was never really an intention to supply humanitarian aid into Gaza. The support was for Israel. It wasn't until December when the administration really started talking about humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. I think that, look, Washington doesn't want there to be a regional conflict. Israel wants to establish its security in a variety of ways, pulverizing Hamas and Gaza, undermining, weakening, pushing Hezbollah back beyond the Litani River. Those are things that risk a broader conflict, which is why the United States has, I would say, mildly prodded the Israelis not to do certain things. And throughout this year, however, every time the United States has said, maybe you shouldn't do X, the Israelis, in keeping with what they have said that they were going to do, have done X. So it is a problem of a mismatch in priorities at the same time while there is this robust institutionalized partnership. And a president, quite frankly, who imagines an Israel that doesn't actually exist. I mean, this is someone who refers to, Golda Meir every time, for the first 4 or 5 months, every time he opened his mouth about Israel, it was Golda Meir. I was in short pants when Golda Meir was you guys weren't even alive when Golda Meir was the prime minister of Israel. You were, I was, you were, but these guys were definitely not. So, I think that there's a set of assumptions here that underpin the relationship. There is a long-standing American interest to help ensure Israeli security, and we see that playing out perfectly. I think the wild card now is, in this interregnum, as politics are changing, as Jim's polls suggest, over a period of time, the politics, at least in the Democratic Party, of the U.S.-Israel relationship is changing. And how will that unfold in this new regional order that is going to emerge, that has not yet emerged?
Can I just say, I think just a
yeah,
clarification.
I'll let you say it. I just want to say that we are 10:42. We have 3 minutes. If you want to quickly retort to that, but I have a final question to you from somebody in the audience.
It's not retort. It's just I get in trouble for saying this, but I don't think we have a special relationship. I think it is partnership. I think it's an exploitative relationship. And I've known too many politicians, worked with too many candidates, seen this unfold where, like Nick said, it's fear. Yes, I love Israel. I love Israel. Because I'm afraid not to. I'll do anything they want because I'm afraid not to. It's like the way the mafia would shoot a dead dog and leave it on somebody's front lawn, like be afraid. It's like we can do to you what we did to Paul Findlay.
I think it's a little too one-dimensional.
I've seen candidates
who've had historical relations, certainly with candidates, but I think broadly with the American people, these things are bound up in, yes, politics, history, theology, historical
With regard
memory.
to the American people, it was the film The Exodus, which was a really beautifully crafted piece of Hezbollah that took cowboys and Indians.
Sorry. We end
Okay.
this part of the conversation between you two here. You
Yes.
can continue later on because I have a final question that I wanted to ask you from Yasmina Abu Zuhur, scholar at Princeton University. She says, she actually addressed this question to Steve, but I'm going to take the liberty of actually addressing it to you. Do you think?
You just got the question taken away from me?
Yeah, that's right. Because,
you are quite the moderator.
Do you think normalization deals? I think you talked about this earlier. Do you think normalization deals will be walked back on either administration?
I don't think the ones that exist are going to get walked back. They've taken root and they're not going anywhere. And but I don't see any new ones in the offing. I don't see the Saudi one. I didn't see it happening before. I don't see it definitely happening now. Do you want to go?
No, I agree with you. Yeah. It's just a bummer.
Yeah.
Okay.
We actually saw in our polling, we did a poll last year. In the summer we started it. we were asking these questions in different countries. On October 7th, we stopped because I thought we needed to take a break. We took a break for a couple of weeks and started the second half afterwards. The numbers were striking in Saudi Arabia. They were taking the lead of the government and moving in one direction. After October 7th and a few weeks in, it was like literally 100% against any form of relationship at all. This has poisoned the well, and I think it's going to stay poisoned for a generation.
Thank you all very much. Esteemed panelists, I thank you, James Zogby, Steve Cook, Natasha Hall, Matthew Duss. It got a little spicy towards the end, which was great. Thank you all very much. Can we please just give them
spice? I'll give you spice.
Can we give them a round of applause?
I'm sorry. I didn't